He came into my care carrying his own instrument of ruin, an iron bar slick with blood and cinder, looked me in the eye, and asked if he would be well enough to return to work by Monday. My name is John Martyn Harlow, physician in the village of Cavendish, Vermont, a place of ledge and timber stitched together by a new iron road that men swear will change how distance behaves. I keep a modest practice on the main street, a white clapboard with a porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a coal scuttle. Behind it lie 4 rooms, a surgery with a stout oak table and 2 glass-fronted cabinets, a back chamber where I set beds and keep a shelf of books for reading to the sick when words are medicine, a little dispensary that smells of alcohol and camphor, and a kitchen where the kettle sings in winter because the stove refuses to keep its satisfaction to itself. On the wall of the surgery hangs a single clock whose second hand has always moved like a gentleman with time enough to be sure, and next to it a framed page torn from a Philadelphia journal reminding me that we, so far from Boston, are still included in the great argument of medicine. Railway works ran in the blood of the town that summer and into the fall of 1848. You could hear the men at dawn pick on stone, the call for powder down and fire. A catechism of progress shouted into the hillside. I had tended smashed thumbs and fractured ulnae, sprains, a kind of rheum that the big men called powder sniffles, and one boy's ear left throbbing from standing too near a blast because he wanted to be brave for his father. I had seen too much of iron in those months to be romantic about it. If you stand on my porch, you can see the cut where they set their charges and where, in the afternoon of September 13th, a tamping iron and a moment of inattention vaulted the world in a new way. The men came first as a roar of boots and voices, then as a tide that broke on my steps, a confusion of hands gesturing and hats clutched to bellies and words tripping over one another, powder, fuse, spark too soon, doctor, oh God, doctor. When the knot of bodies parted, I saw him. He came under his own power, 2 men supporting his elbows more from love than necessity. He was 25 by his mother's account, a foreman by the company's, a man of firm countenance by everyone's, Phineas P. Gage, of Stratford originally, who kept a crew in line without shouting, who handled men and powder with equal respect, and who wore his cap at a slight, can't like someone who could permit himself a private joke because the public work would be done. He walked. He spoke. His left cheek was torn open like a pocket turned inside out, and the region above his left eye had ceased to be a roof and was now a terrible bright window. Across the crooks of 2 men's arms lay the instrument of his ruination and his fame, a tamping iron 3 feet 7 inches long, 1 1/4 inches in diameter, octagonal in section except where it was ground to a point for love of its work. It was polished by use and, that day, by his skull. He had carried it, they told me, from the site to my door with a kind of irritated dignity, as if it had misbehaved and he would see it corrected. Doctor, he said, as though ordering coffee, I take it the iron went through my head. It is hard for a man's face to maintain its composure when his mind is reeling, so I made my hands do the studying for both of us. You're with me now, I said. Come in. Be still. I set him on the oak table and cut away the remnants of his shirt. The iron lay to the side, like a sickle laid aside after harvest. Blood had a sweet, warm smell, and under it a different odor, powder, and something the nose learns once and never forgets, that belongs only to the inside of a skull. I have not used the word brain yet. There are words that unsettle the living into a morbid interest that helps no one. But it was there, pink, white, pulsing like bread rising too fast, pushing at an opening made by impatient iron. I washed. I trimmed torn scalp as neatly as a barber at his best, for neatness gives hands orders when there is no time to take counsel from anything else. I warmed my forceps in whiskey because the bottle was nearer than the kettle and because men do better with the scent they know. I removed fragments of bone that rang delicately against the steel of my instruments in a music that woke something improper in my throat. He vomited with an independence that startled me and sat up to do it, then apologized for the mess as if he were in a drawing room and had knocked over a vase. While I irrigated the wound, a portion of brain, that is the simplest way to say it, oozed to the surface and came away in my cloth. I have written in my notes about a teacupful, though who measures such a thing in a moment like that except a man who wishes later to be believed? His eye on that side was clouded and would not blink at the drop of water. His speech, which had been crisp and practical, wandered, then returned, then wandered again. I set compresses. I drew the skin where skin could meet itself and married its edges with the best stitches my hands knew, not because I believed stitches would save his thinking, but because they would save his life. I asked for fresh linens and for a basin of cool water, and the women of the town came, as if from the ground, with baskets and quiet mouths. We carried him to the back room, where the light behaves itself and the air, which in a surgery is always alert, relaxes into the kind that allows a man to sleep. When he woke, he was, astonishingly, himself enough to speak his own name and ask after his men. He drank when offered, and his throat swallowed on command. His pulse, when it behaved like a pulse, was strong. When it misbehaved, it ran like a horse. I bled him once, not out of habit, but because his face grew a color that meant too much pressure in a place that refuses to stretch, and the relief in his breath argued for the old practice, if only in that moment. I leeched him around the wound the next day when the edges grew angry, and I regret nothing about it. The night after, fever scoped in the corners and then took the middle of the room. It came with the bright eye of a thief and the slow smile of someone who knows he will have his way if he only leans on a door long enough. The scalp wept. There was an odor like a sweet cider left in a warm barn. I cleaned, poulticed with bread and milk, then with charcoal and yeast when that seemed wiser. And when the skin around the wound began to rise like an angry doe, I took up the scalpel again and lanced a pocket of pus that left the room smelling like a factory of glue for an hour. He slept. He woke. He muttered in what I took at first to be nonsense, and then realized were the terms of his trade: tamp, prime, cap, fuse, down, and then, to my surprise and everyone's, he burst into a string of odes that would have made the devil himself step back for the heat of them. The women exchanged a look. The men laughed with relief and then, catching the expression of his mother, fell silent. I will set down here, for those who will read this after, the facts as cleanly as I can. The iron entered at the left cheek, passing behind the eye, and emerged through the top of the skull a little forward of the bregma, tearing away bone and dura and such part of the anterior left cerebrum as lay in its impatience. I have drawn the track in my ledger with a ruler and a pencil, and the kind of sorrow humans reserve for diagrams of the unthinkable. I sent to Boston for opinions because Boston likes to be asked, and because in truth I needed the comfort of a city that would write back in rational sentences while I kept night watch in a room that smelled of poultice and whiskey. For weeks we lived in the slow weather of convalescence. It is not the done thing in medical papers to speak of the creaturely realities, but I will here because they are the truth. He sweated like a man in a forge. He fouled the linens and was humiliated by it in his moments of clarity. We changed his dressings 4 times a day, and he flinched less each time, which is how you can tell the body is admitting a new normal. His left eyelid lost the habit of closing. His appetite returned with a vengeance that made the neighbor women shake their heads. And then bring more broth. His crew came in pairs, hats in hands, and stood at the foot of the bed and shifted from one boot to the other like boys called to account and said nothing, which was their way of saying everything. When at last I took down the last of the dressings and left only a neat line, hair trying to knit over it like grass across a seam in stone, he sat on the side of the bed and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately sort. It was at once grateful and impatient, as if he wished to thank me for pulling him back to the world and to chide me for not doing it faster. "I will be at the cut on Monday," he said, as if Monday were a law and his body a mere clerk who must carry papers between days. "You will not," I said, with the same tone I have used to men twice his age who imagine they can bargain with nature by offering her a cleverly worded petition. He did come to my porch on Monday, had at a tilt calculated to make light of the mangled lid beneath it. He sat and described to a stranger, with a cheerfulness that affronted the poor man's sense of appropriate awe, the measurements of the rod 3 feet 7 inches, 1 1/4 inches through, 13 pounds by my kitchen scale, and how, on his oath, it had passed through his head and not by it. "I suppose I shall return to work," he added, "as soon as the doctor will permit, for he is a tyrant with a small smile and 2 daughters who do not respect a man at all." He laughed at his own fun, too loudly for a porch. His mother wrapped her shawl close, though the day was not cold. What changed first was not his gait, though that had a new flourish to it, nor his memory, which could still produce names and days like a magician flipping cards. It was the temper of his choosing. Before the accident, men tell me, he was a person of even habit and purpose, most efficient, said his employer at the time in a letter that sits, folded twice, in my ledger, firm and obstinate in a good way. Said a man who had clashed with him once and came to respect the collision. After, he began to make promises quickly and to tire of the work of keeping them, to spend money he did not have as if the future were a table he could flip when it displeased him, to speak vulgarly in the presence of ladies and to be pleased with the effect his words made, to laugh at his own coarse jests until the room went quiet around him, and then to grow angry because it had grown quiet. He attempted to resume his place at the works. The company, not unkind and not willing to court disaster, demurred. This was an insult he could not parse. He called the foreman a word I will not write here, and then, half an hour later, hat in hand, went to the same man's wife to ask if he might borrow a pie because hunger had come on him suddenly, and he had misplaced his purse. When she, out of pity and a kind of curiosity, gave him 2 slices wrapped in cloth, he kissed her on the cheek in a manner that presumed too much on his reputation as a miracle and walked away whistling a tune no one else knew. He could still cipher and write. He came to my office with a little book in which he had sketched the iron and then written, in a hand that would have pleased a schoolmaster, "This is the bar that went through my head." He set it on my desk like a challenge, and I read the capital letters aloud to humor him and to give myself a line between us. "Does that mean I am learned?" he asked, and flashed a grin that could have been a boy's and almost was. One evening I found him at the tavern describing for 2 traveling men the exact path of the iron, tapping his cheek with the rod's blunt end, for yes, he often carried it, and then setting its point on his hat brim and letting it balance there like the needle of a compass. The men, exhausted by a day's ride, laughed and pressed him with questions as though horror could be made into a parlor trick and therefore would not visit their own houses. Phineas obliged them with details finer than any request, and when the barkeep tried to wave the iron off the counter, Phineas lifted it and brought the butt down on the oak with a force that made the mugs hop. "Gentle as a lamb, my iron," he said, and winked at me. I wanted at that moment to be a man without temper. Instead, I put a $50 down for his supper and took the bar under my arm and carried it to my office. You will ask me, as others have, whether I knew then what I knew later, that an injuring of the front of the brain, a portion the older anatomists gave over to fancy because it seemed to do nothing, could take from a man restraint without touching his cleverness, could make a rogue of a gentleman without unseating his knowledge of dates and faces, could tilt the floor of the mind so that the furniture slid from its old corners and came to rest at odd angles. I did not know it in the way the city knows things, with a meeting in a hall, a paper read aloud, glassed cabinets of specimens. I knew it in the way a village doctor learns, by watching a man over a winter, by seeing his mother weep against her shawl, by feeling that chastened fear that lives in the center of a good practitioner. The fear that you have done all that can be done, and still nature will take your patient down another path and dare you to follow with your language. When Boston wrote back, it did so with a skeptical courtesy. We should be obliged for more particulars, one gentleman wrote, a hand like tiny scissors running over the page. The extent of injury seems incompatible with continued vigor. I sent, in reply, a drawing of the skull as I understood it. I sent the measurements of the iron copied twice and thrice. I sent testimony from 3 men of the crew with their signatures made in an X, and one waggish man wrote his name as if he were signing a banknote. I sent a little of the cloth I had used on the first day, though by then it had only a faint memory of its own history. When they finally believed, they believed with gusto and asked if I would like to bring both man and bar to a hall to be looked at. I said yes, and then I thought better and said no. I did not want my patient made into a lantern slide for men who would sleep in their own beds that night and wake only to intellectual hangovers. He did not need Boston to make a curiosity of himself. He tired of Cavendish when Cavendish tired of him, which is to say when novelty was not longer equal to mischief. He went to New York and, by letters I received from a cousin who owed me $8 and paid in gossip, to a museum where Mr. Barnum made a business of slaking the public's thirst for both inspiration and deformity. There is a cruelty to that thirst, but there is also, I grudgingly admit, a sense that attention itself can be a kind of bread. Phineas, who could no longer keep a ledger straight nor a job longer than a season, discovered that he could keep a room laughing and wincing in equal proportion by holding up his iron and telling his story. I have imagined him doing it as he did on my porch, jaunty, defiant, boyish, and boorish in the same breath. For a time he drove a stage in Chile. I know this because a letter came addressed to me with a stamp I had never seen and Spanish words I sounded out like a child. Inside was a note, also in Spanish, from a man with a neat hand and a fondness for exclamation points, saying that Mr. Gage was beloved for his strong arm and merry way, and for how he played the bugle at inns to gather passengers. The letter had been forwarded by a ship captain who had met him on a wharf and had been charmed into believing that the bird of death itself had flown through that man and taught him its song. I confess I smiled when I read it, and then later, when I had finished smiling, I set the letter in my ledger and wrote in the margin, "Motion equals management." While he was away, I gave talks to small groups of doctors and farmers who wanted to know if one could take away the demon of anger with a careful injury to the head. I told them no. I told them we must not let ourselves become butchers in hopes of carving virtue. I told them only what I had seen, that an injury to the front portions of the brain might diminish a man's respect for the future and for the rules he had formerly set himself, that the appetite took the place of plan, that there remained a cleverness unmoored from prudence, which is its ballast. I try to say it without saying the word soul. If I succeeded, it was because they already knew that word and did not need me to touch it. Phineas came back from Chile thinner and tanned, and with a Spanish song in his mouth that he could not keep to himself. He showed me how he held the reins with his left hand and used the right, the iron tucked along the seat like a favorite cane, to point at crests and valleys and danger. He had learned to roll his eyes for effect, which made his ruined lid eerier and also, shame upon me, now and then funny. He told me he had not fallen ill once in 2 years, then coughed a cough that did not belong to a brag. He stayed in San Francisco with relatives for a time and worked in a stable. He wrote once, in a letter dictated because his hand had grown less interested in paper, that he was mending, which can mean so many things that it is almost an insult to the truth. When the seizures came, they came like men who have waited long at a door that finally forgot to lock itself. His mother wrote to me because there was no one else in our part of the world, she said, who had looked at his head that way and not flinched. She wrote a list of humiliations, bitten tongue, bitten cheek, wetted sheets, a bruise on a shoulder from falling in a doorway, the sound a table makes when a body strikes it, and asked if there was powder or pill that would make a brain change its mind. I wrote back with the white lie we tell when we need to speak without hurting, that there are comforts and there are observations and the company of people who do not despair of you. I also sent a small packet of pills, compounded as carefully as I knew how, and instructed that they be given nightly. They helped, and then they did not. He died in May of 1860 in a room that looked, I hope, out on a piece of sky not too crowded by buildings. I did not see him. I received instead a letter from his family with a tone of scorched paper. Our Phineas is gone. They asked for money and for a recommendation for a churchyard. I sent what I could and the name of a place that harbored many inexplicable stories and would welcome another. Then came a request from Boston, could they have the skull, and a request from me, could I have the bar, and another meeker request from the family, could I not take him apart a second time? In the end, we did a thing that would have scandalized my own dear mother. We exhumed. I thought as I stood by with my mouth full of the taste of dirt that the living have always found ways to use the dead. The skull came up wrapped as if it had been thinking of modesty. The hole from cheek to crown was a shape that made my hand ache. The left eye socket stared with an indignation skulls sometimes have, because they remember lids. The iron slid, with shocking indifference, through the rents, and I had a thought that is not fit for publication, that physics cares not a whit for anyone's future. I brought the skull to Boston and argued with men whose Latin was better than their listening. I set the iron on a table long enough to seat 12 professors, and all their appetites and the old anger in me rose up when one gentleman, who had never sat on a bed with a man who smelled of sweat and serum, patted the bar as if it were a handsome dog. Then the better part of me returned, and I saw it as they did, not a fetish but a specimen, not a relic but a proof. They took notes. They made drawings. They muttered about localizations, about the frontal lobes, about moral sense and volition. They glanced at me now and then as if I might suffer a relapse into being a villager and start telling a story, and I disappointed them by being plain. He lived. He changed. He later died of seizures. The injury was frontal. His intellect remained intact in counts and names. His behavior lost its governor. They nodded as if I had passed a test. What remains for me now is not the respect of Boston nor the little engraving in some journal that distills a man's pain into an oval image with cross-hatching. What remains is a series of rooms. The first where men arrived in a rush and set him on my table, the iron ringing faintly when it touched wood. The second where he slept and woke and stared at my face with the politeness that bled into sarcasm and back again. The porch where he told his story and laughed too loud. The tavern where he made a parlor trick of survival. The imaginary inn in Chile where a bugle called passengers and a man with a ruined eye grinned at the absurdity of being alive. The San Francisco room where he fell and someone lifted his head and spoke as if he were listening. These are not medical proofs. They are the furniture of my memory. If anyone asks me at the end of my own life whether I did something grand, I will say I kept a man's blood inside him long enough for him to prove to the world that the front of the brain is not a vanity. That is something. You wish, perhaps, that I would say whether men are their brains. It is too hard a question for a doctor with a ledger and a child who sits on his knee and asks whether lightning is a person. I will say this. The brain is a house with many rooms and narrow halls. Some doors lead to kitchens where appetites are kept tidy, some to studies where plans are laid, some to parlors where we behave ourselves, some to back porches where we spit and swear. If a rod tears out the walls between one set and another, you may still find books in the study and food in the larder, but the weather will blow through in strange ways, and the people who live there will be cold at odd hours and throw open windows when they ought not. This is not moral. It is architecture. Once, not long after I sent the skull to Boston and the iron to a museum of virtues and horrors, a man traveling north stopped at my porch and asked if I were the doctor who had kept Gage alive. I said I was and invited him to sit because the day was hot and men tend to make worse questions standing. He told me he had a nephew, a good boy who has taken up a wickedness with cards, and asked whether a small injury to the head might correct the boy's course. I looked in his face to see if he were jesting. He was not. The worst ideas are always put in the same tone as reasonable ones. We will not operate upon a soul, I said. We will not take the chisel to a trait and pretend we are improving a window frame. We will keep boys away from card tables where we can and teach them to carry their luck like gentlemen when we cannot. He nodded and went away disappointed in modern medicine. I have kept my notes. I have had them copied. I have spoken when asked and kept my silence when I could. The iron, I am told, rests gleaming in a cabinet, and now and then a woman or a boy or a man with a lunch pail in his hand stops and stares at it and feels at once sick and proud. Sick that a skull is weak before such a thing, proud that a man survived it. That is a fair balance. There is one more scene I carry, and if you will forgive a doctor for trespassing into the theater of feeling for a moment, I will set it down. Phineas came to me once after Chile and before California, a visit that lasted the length of 2 cigars and a story about a stagecoach that came loose at speed and how he managed to drift the team to a stop, as a boy in a canoe might drag his paddle as a rudder. He was in a mood to tell me I had saved him twice, once with stitches, once with shame, for I had the day before spoken sharply to him in front of my daughters when he cursed at a boy selling papers. I said to him then, "You're a man the world will make either an example of or a warning to. You may choose which." He laughed and said, "Perhaps both, doctor. I am efficient at 2 things at once." Then he grew suddenly, almost boyishly, serious. "Do you suppose," he asked, tapping his temple with the blunt end of the iron he had come to collect, "that if it had gone a 1/4 inch to the right, I would be a saint?" I said what was both true and kind. If it had gone a 1/4 inch to the right, you would be a ghost. He accepted that like a hymn and went away, and I watched him pass down the street, the bar over his shoulder, the hat at its trusty angle, the left lid low, the gait a little cocky because these United States admire a swagger, especially when attached to a story. He turned the corner and vanished, which is the best anyone can do. Years later, when I am old enough that boys escort me across the street as if it were an ocean, and I let them because they need to practice, I will sit on this same porch and see the men of the railroad laying iron not through stone, but through the muscle of a country. And I will think, we make straight lines in a world that is not straight. Sometimes nature accommodates our arrogance. Sometimes she sends a rod up through a cheek and out a skull and says, "Draw your lessons here." I drew mine. I offer them to you without ornament. A man lived. A man changed. A science moved one step from myth toward description. Between those statements is a town, a mother, a bar of iron, a bed, a diary, a handful of stitches, a winter of watchfulness, a smirking laugh, a bugle in Chile, a fall in a doorway, a hole in a bone, and a physician with soap-stung hands standing very still in a bright room so as not to spill the truth. I suppose it is fitting that the object itself, his iron, was as much a tool of his life as of his maiming. He kept it near as if hoping usefulness could expiate ruin. Once, when I had hidden it behind a cabinet in a childish attempt to control the narrative of a grown man, he came into my office and sniffed the air, and then went straight to the hiding place and pulled it out as though a magnet lived in him. He said, "Now, doctor, that is a poor trick," and kissed the bar as a man kisses the handle of a plow before the season begins. I learned at that moment that removal is not cure. If it were, we would all be angels. Do not make idols of survivors. Do not make monsters of the changed. Do not treat the brain as a lantern that can be trimmed to throw only the light you prefer. If you need an image, use this one: a house with rooms, a hallway with doors, a narrow stair, an instrument that fell from a man's hand and then rose through him, a set of stitches, a town that learned to look and not gawk, a doctor who learned to listen to behavior as carefully as to breath, and the simple, enormous miracle of a man sitting up, blood on his lips, saying with awful clarity, "I take it the iron went through my head." If I could end with a single sentence that would make the medical men nod and the laity feel held, I would write that the frontal portions of the cerebrum are in some intimate relation with the moral faculties, which sentence I have in fact written in plainer form in my published account. But because I am allowed, here, to speak as a person and not as a paper, I will finish with this. The day after Phineas should have died, he asked for breakfast. The week after, he joked. The month after, he insulted a man who loved him. The year after, he told audiences why they should laugh. A decade after, he succumbed to storms that had been gathering in him since the afternoon a spark leapt where it ought not, and the iron took the quickest path between 2 points and taught us all to be wary of line and proud of curve. He would have liked that last phrase for its flourish. He deserved it for his endurance. And if I, in giving it, am guilty of a small poetry, I beg the reader to forgive a country doctor who, having stood between iron and annihilation for one astonishing hour, would prefer that this story men remember have a cadence strong enough to stand as long as a bar of steel.